Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it happens to be when you're watching this video. Thanks for tuning in. As always, on my channel, it's me, Gordon Causey, coming to you live and unscripted. Most of the content that I publish to my YouTube channel, almost all of it, is unscripted thoughts right off the top of my head. The thoughts that are ruminating around in my uh, tiny imperfect little human brain. And I invite you to come along for the ride and to share your thoughts. Tell me whether you think I'm crazy, whether I'm bang on the money. If you disagree with me, that's fine. I wanted to talk tonight, or it's nighttime right now where I am. Uh, talk about our newly installed Prime Minister Mark Carney, who at some point in the coming days, weeks, months, will be sending Canadians to the polls to determine whether or not he gets to remain in the position into which he was installed. Mark Carney has become Prime Minister of Canada absent a federal election. Canadians writ large did not vote for Mark Carney to be the Prime Minister of Canada. He was chosen by Liberal Party of Canada members, and because the Liberals have the most seats in their House of Commons, whoever their leader happens to be, however that individual is chosen, that individual automatically becomes Prime Minister. And this has happened before in Canadian history with both the Conservatives and the Liberals. It happened in the Mulroney era when the sitting Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, resigned and was replaced by Kim Campbell, and she was sworn in as Canada's Prime Minister. It happened again after Pierre Elliott Trudeau resigned leadership of the Liberal Party, was replaced by John Turner, and John Turner became the Prime Minister of Canada. And neither Kim Campbell nor John Turner ever got elected to be Prime Minister. They served as Prime Minister, but only as unelected Prime Ministers. It has happened in Canadian history. And we are going to be having an election, as I say. It could be called in days, weeks, months. I don't really have a prediction as to when it's coming. Initially, I thought Carney would go very quickly to the polls, but it's looking to me more and more like he's going to take some time until perhaps as he may even go past March 24th when Parliament is set to reconvene. Right now, the government of Canada has been prorogued. That is the parliamentary term. It simply means suspended. And Mark Carney has just enacted, um, it's not legislation. What he's done is he's taken the carbon tax that was imposed on by his predecessor with Mark Carney over the past 5 years, has been advising Justin Trudeau on economic policy. But the carbon tax has now been reduced to 0%. And that was not done by an act of parliament. That was done by something referred to as an order in council, meaning it bypasses scrutiny. If Mark Carney wanted to actually eliminate the legislation concerning carbon taxation, then that would require an act of parliament. But to reduce it down to zero, he can do that with an order in council. And why was Carney and others advising Trudeau to hammer Canadians with high inflation, doubling our housing costs? We all see it at the grocery store when we fill up our cart and we find out, $100 doesn't go very far. Two, three, $400 a shopping trip to feed a family of 4 or 5 people. Insanely expensive now. And why has this pain and misery been heaped on Canadians for so long? And again, with Trudeau as Prime Minister, but with Mark Carney advising him. And it's because both Trudeau and Carney are all in on the narrative concerning climate change. And this, I think, is the biggest point of attack for those who do not want to see this former central banker who moves jobs from Toronto to New York City, who refuses to disclose his financial holdings to Canadians prior to an election being called. You know, he's relying on a love-in fest with the media. He's traveling around the world. He's been to France. He's been to Britain. He's at the top of the news cycle, not just here in Canada, but at international outlets, liberal-friendly news outlets like BBC News in Britain or CNN down in the United States. And they're all speaking glowingly of Mark Carney because he is the preferred candidate of the corporate sector, of our globalist corporate elite. These multinational corporations want Mark Carney heading up the government of Canada. And one of the reasons is because he's all in on the notion of it's called anthropogenic climate change. And anthropogenic is simply a fancy word that means man made. Humans cause climate change. And I've, in the thumbnail to this video, I have a emotional picture of a gaunt, emaciated polar bear on a bare, tundra of land, no snow anywhere. And yeah, it tugs at the heartstrings. Polar bears are majestic looking animals, and to see one all emaciated, it it impacts an individual at an emotional level. And that's the design of the media. They know that humanity, human beings, that we are at our heart, at our base, we are emotional creatures at our core. Intellectual comes secondary. If you can hit someone at an emotional level, you can get them to shut off their higher thought process and you can get them to react on emotion. And again, we are emotional beings before we are intellectual beings. And any video that I or anyone else that puts out that centers on this question of anthropogenic or man-made climate change, automatically the masters at Google and YouTube and across social media will put out disclaimers. They will put out kind of a fact check. And here's what it will say on this video. I'm 99.9% certain because it has shown up on other videos I've done. And it will say that climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. And this will be cited with the authority of the United Nations. Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. That it's two sentences long. That's the first sentence, and I don't have an issue with the first sentence. Fair enough. Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. And we've seen that over, if you're as old as me, older, or in my neighborhood, if you've been around, if you're in your 30s or 40s or older, you likely notice that climatic changes have taken place. I know that the winters that we experience now in Canada typically are nowhere near as harsh as they were in my younger years, say 50 years ago. I'm 58 now. I remember the winters, the Canadian winters when I was 10 years old, um, were incredibly harsh, tons of snow, very cold temperatures, and it's milder now and there's not as much snow. There has been a climactic change. There has been long-term shifts. Didn't happen overnight. Long-term shifts. I don't have an issue with that. We all know the climate changes, obviously. But the second sentence I have an issue with, and this is what it will say. As per the United Nations, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. I have an issue with that because that's stated as fact, but it's not proven. And I'm going to show you how it is unproven. There was a period, and you can look this up, you can go, just use a simple search, go to reputable sources, go to academic sources, even government sources, and you'll find out that there was a period that lasted in and around 400 years, referred to as the medieval warming period. When it started, when it ended, there is some variance among academic sources. Some put the start around 950 AD, some around 1000. The end period is sometime around 1400 AD, again, or if you prefer, Common Era. So you have a window of about 400 years when we went through what is referred to as the medieval warming period. To give this some scope and some understanding, what happened during this time is that the Vikings were traveling by Greenland, and that is how it got its name. Greenland, they noticed that this was a green and inviting land. The Vikings actually established permanent settlements in Greenland or on Greenland that lasted for 200 to 300 years because of climate change. Now, what YouTube is going to say is that human activities have been, past tense of the verb, have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. So the Vikings and the however many people were on planet Earth back in 1000, 1100, 1200, it was human activity causing this climate change. If human activities have been the main driver, is that only now? It wasn't back then? Give me a break. And then around 1400, we entered into another period, and again, you can verify this. It's called the Little Ice Age. And again, the dates vary depending upon the academic sources. But in and around 1400, we entered into what is called the Little Ice Age, and it ended sometime in and around 1800. And that period saw a dramatic climactic change as well. The Vikings had to abandon those settlements that they'd established in Greenland because the climate was changing. It got warmer, then it got colder, and now around 1800, again, the exact starting date is not, it's debated. We entered into another warming phase. Now, that medieval warming period lasted in and around 400 years. It was followed by a cooling period that lasted in and around 400 years. So, if the warming period that we're in now is slated to run for around 400 years, then we're a little more than halfway through with a lot more to come. We shall see what happens. I have an issue with the scientific fallacy of declaring cause and effect absent evidence. And this is why we have the scientific method. This is why we conduct experiments. I'll give an example. There in the year 2010, Icelandic volcanoes erupted and emitted large plumes of volcanic ash into the atmosphere. And climatologists contended that that release of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, that it led to a brief period of global cooling because the ash released into the atmosphere refracted ultraviolet radiation from getting to the earth from the sun, and so you get a little bit of a cooling effect short term. That's unproven. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's an interesting theory and it may very well be true, but it is not proven. And the reason that it is not proven is to prove it, you would have to engage in the scientific method. You would have to be able to demonstrate what happens with the climate with volcanic ash being spewed into the atmosphere, and then measure that against what the atmosphere would do or what the climate would do in the absence of that volcanic ash. Now, obviously, it's impossible to conduct such an experiment. Once that volcanic ash goes off, we're stuck with it and we can't determine what would have happened had the volcanic ash not been emitted into our atmosphere. It's the same with climate change alarmists who say that the main drivers, the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, it was in the late 1700s, early 1800s that we embarked on a period of industrialization. And we saw, I think, primarily coal earlier on, but then oil and gas later being sent into the atmosphere. But does this cause dramatic changes in the Earth's climatic patterns, which we already know from studying history? We know that we have periods of warming, cooling, cyclical patterns that last centuries in order to determine that, yes, indeed, it is coal, oil, gas, and other fossil fuels, this greenhouse effect, then we would have to have uh, uh, an experiment taking place wherein an exact replica model of the Earth would have to see what the climatic patterns were absent the emission of these fossil fuels in the atmosphere. And again, this is impossible to do. And the reason it's impossible to do is because there are simply too many variables and too little is understood about climate. The variables probably number in the hundreds. And when so called climate scientists do their research into changing climatic patterns, what they're forced to do is they cherry pick. They pick which variables they are going to measure, and they ignore others. There are things we simply don't understand. We know more about the heavens above us, know more about the moon and the stars and the sun, the solar system, the galaxy. We know more about the sky above us than we do about the ground beneath our feet. We've been higher up in the air than we have been deep into, we've never pierced the Earth's crust. So we don't, all we're left with is theoretical models of what's existing below our very feet. And so are there geothermal influences? Well, we don't know, so we're not going to include those models. The ocean tides and ocean currents have an impact on climate, but we don't understand how they work, and we don't understand the geothermic influence on ocean currents. So climate scientists ignore that data. They ignore those variables because they don't understand them. And to put a fine point on this and wrap up the video, right now, India, China, countries that have in and around 1.4 billion people each. And to put that into some scope, both China and India have populations that are 35 times greater than that of Canada. We are 40 million. China is 1.4 billion. Do the math. China is, or rather, yes, China is, could be divided up into 35 separate countries of 40 million each. Likewise with India. And China in particular keeps bringing on more and more coal-fired generation for electricity to fuel their growing economy, while Canadians are being impoverished and being told to freeze in the dark by guys like Mark Carney, who, yes, he took the carbon tax and he reduced it down to zero, and he's saying he's going to replace it, and he's going to impose carbon taxation, carbon levies. I don't know how exactly he's going to frame it, but he's going to put it directly onto companies. And what that means is that the costs will be passed down to the consumer, and we're going to continue to be hammered by high inflation. We're going to continue to destroy our economy while China keeps growing their economy by burning more and more fossil fuel because cheap energy fuels an economy. And even if Canada achieves this nirvana of net zero emissions, meaning we put net zero, no carbon going into the atmosphere from Canada, if we get down to zero, it's not going to matter because we're a pipsqueak. There are Goliaths, China, India, spewing tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And personally, my attitude, hey, China, fill your boots. And Canada should do likewise. Carney was a big proponent of canceling pipelines that would have sent much cleaner Canadian energy like LNG, liquefied natural gas, and oil to refineries. We had the proposed Northern Gateway pipeline. We had the proposed Energy East pipeline. And liberals like Mark Carney opposed the building of those pipelines while at the same time supporting pipelines being built in foreign countries, giving foreign countries jobs, improving the economy elsewhere while destroying the lives of Canadians. If we're going to defeat this guy, if you're a simple guy like myself, and you've got to start talking about this with everyone, and you have to have your talking points ready. You have to tell people. Mark Carney has taken all his assets, things like the shares he owns in Brookfield Asset Management, company he used to be chairman of the board for when they voted to move Canadian jobs down to New York City. He moved those assets into what is referred to as a blind trust. But when he moved them over, he knew what was in there. And he has not disclosed to Canadians what his asset portfolio looks like. Now, he's not required to yet. He's given a 60-day window to disclose that information to the ethics commissioner. And then there's a further 60-day window. So we're now up to 4 months before that information is disclosed to Canadians. And it's highly likely that Canadians will be voting in an election before that. This is an unusual situation. It's rare that Canada is led by an individual who wasn't chosen in a general election. But Carney is hiding behind the letter of the law in order to not disclose what his financial holdings are. When he makes orders in council that impact the financial well-being of Canadians, is he doing it ethically? Is he being ethical? He knows what went into his blind trust, or is he perhaps seeking to enrich himself, to add a few more $1 million to his stock portfolio? We don't know. He's not required, technically, to tell us. But ethics is more than mere technicalities. It's about doing what is right. And for Mark Carney, if he wants to lead this country, he should be open and transparent and not hiding behind the letter of the law. We just endured 10 years of a prime minister who accepted gifts from the Aga Khan, whose charitable foundation receives large sums of money from the Canadian government, something you're not supposed to do. That's unethical. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, strike one. The WE charity, was likewise given large Canadian untendered contracts to do work for the government of Canada. And that same WE charity employed Justin Trudeau's family. His mother and brother paid them lucrative speaking engagements. Ethical strike number two. And the third strike on Trudeau was the worst, when he interfered in a criminal proceeding that was being taken against SNC Lavalin, an engineering firm based in Canada, and Trudeau I don't want to get into the full, well, what happened was they were accused of bribing government officials in foreign countries to win contracts. And that contravenes Canadian laws for a Canadian-based company. So they were being charged by the Attorney General and her office, Jody Wilson-Raybould. And Trudeau, because SNC Lavalin is a big corporate donor to the Liberal Party of Canada, interceded on SNC Lavalin's behalf and tried to get Jody Wilson-Raybould to drop the case and to engage in what is referred to as a deferred prosecutorial agreement, basically a plea bargain that would give them a little slap on the wrist, a fine, but no conviction, and they could continue operating business as usual. And Jody Wilson-Raybould showed ethical fortitude and refused to bow to the unethical and ultimately, in my opinion, illegal, heinously illegal activity of the Prime Minister's office. And because she stood up to the Prime Minister, an unethical Prime Minister, she was fired. And that was just, and Canadians, yet knowing this, 32% or so still voted for the Liberals in our last two federal elections. And we're coming up to an election now with a man who appears to have the exact same ethical challenges that Justin Trudeau had, who has been advising Trudeau for the past 5 years, going back to about the year 2020. He's been acting as a senior advisor on economic matters to Justin Trudeau as we've seen the economy fall off a cliff. Is this the man we want leading Canada? My opinion is no. And I invite you to engage with me regularly on my channel. I'll be talking about this a lot. I also talk a lot about my Christian faith. And I know that turns some people off. We've been conditioned in today's world to think that, hey, life is all just a random accident and feelings are more important than the basic fabric of reality as created by, I'm here to say, we are the creation. We are not the creator. And this was not a random accident. We are not just matter and motion. We are not simply the product of time plus matter plus chance. And I'll talk more about that as well. But I invite you to engage with me. Comment in the comment section below. I do a lot of live videos where you can engage with me live in the live chat box. And hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I hope to see you around. I have to wear this stupid headset now because when I do pre-recorded videos, the sound quality isn't that great. Hopefully this came out okay. I do also appreciate constructive criticism. So I'll leave you there. God bless. And yes, God is he's reaching out his hand to you. He wants to form a relationship with you. You do have a purpose. You do have a meaning in this life. You are not just matter and motion. You are not just the product of a random accident. There's a purpose. And by getting into a relationship with the one who created everything, you can discover it. You can find out. You can live it. Anyway, God bless, and we'll talk to you hopefully when you show back up, when I'm doing a live, whatever the case. Good night all, good morning, good afternoon, whatever it happens to be.